We are live. Okay. Theologizing Subject.
Hey, Caleb, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you, Caleb. All right, I'm hearing something now. Yes, now I can hear.
How about now?
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
I regret, but you're going to have to start from the top. You had a false start there,
That's fine.
shipmate.
And also, you're coming through my computer again. That's unfortunate.
Okay. We may have to live with that, otherwise we'll keep the listeners waiting.
Okay, you just want to try that?
It's up to you. You're the host.
Okay. Yeah, let's go for it, because I think it's just going to switch back on you. So, okay. All right. Do you think our modern political system is a success? Many of us have answered with an emphatic no, and are on the hunt for a better political answer that honors Christ as Lord and defends against secularism with conviction. I've recently been pondering the political implications and cultural outworkings of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Our society at large has experienced secularism and its results, stemming all the way back from the Enlightenment, and found it wanting, to say the least. Many Christians have overtly rejected the false idea of political neutrality, as our borders are invaded, our values trampled on, and our Christian freedoms are slowly eroded in real time. The Constitution has not stopped this. Liberalism has been weak and defenseless in light of these threats. In what little I've explored, it seems evident that Protestantism, particularly in the West, has lent itself toward a society governed by democratic tendencies, as we see today, leading towards some type of bland liberalism that has failed to uphold the Christian moral framework, regardless of how it started. We, the people, are retarded. I say this as a convicted Protestant living in this country. And my question tonight is, did Orthodoxy provide a better framework for a political system than what we see today? What results did it produce politically and morally in the regions it was allowed to thrive? In other words, what political lessons can we learn from the Byzantine Empire? This is the subject we will be discussing this evening. This topic has successfully tempted me to wade back into the scary world of the internet and start trying to have some interesting conversations again. Well, Paul, I skipped some of my...
All right, hang on there, Caleb. I just lost your feed again, right after you finished your monologue. I'm afraid I cannot hear you. Cannot hear you, sir. All right, are you able to hear me? Just nod if you can. Okay. All right, I regret the technical difficulties we had because it is, in my opinion, an extremely interesting subject. And if my microphone at any point cuts out, just wave or something, and then we'll stop and try to fix it. The subject that we're going to talk about is political lessons from the Byzantine Empire. I think we all know what politics refers to. The term that may be unfamiliar, I can hear you.
Oh,
Say
great.
something. Say testing 1, 2, 3.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yep, there you are. Don't know what went wrong, but now we're back in action. All right. The Byzantine Empire is also known as the East Roman Empire. If we're going to use the shorter dating method, we could say that the Byzantine Empire lasted from AD 324, which is when Constantine was made the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, up until 1453, which is the fall of Constantinople. So if I'm doing the math right, AD 324 to 1453 is 1,129 years. This is an empire that lasted for 1,100 years. And virtually nobody in the United States or Western Europe has heard of it. We'll get back to that bizarre factoid a little bit later in the show. There is another way of dating the Byzantine Empire because Byzantine is a contemporary word. It's not a word that the people of the Byzantine Empire would have used. They never would have called themselves Byzantines. They simply called themselves Romans. Well, the Roman Empire, beginning with the city of Rome, was founded in 753 by Romulus, at least according to their mythology. So if you date from 753 BC to AD 1453, that's 2,206 years that the empire lasted. However, I think that intuitively, most of us in the modern world, when we think of the Byzantine Empire, we think of Constantine forward. So we'll say that the Byzantine Empire lasted from AD 324 to 1453. Again, the bookends there are when Constantine I became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and 1453 when the Turks destroyed Constantinople. That's the Byzantine Empire. Now, where was it? When I was in elementary school, the few times the history books mentioned the Byzantine Empire, they usually showed a map. The map included Greece and what we now call Turkey. So Greece and Anatolia. That is indeed what we all think of when we think of the Byzantine Empire. But at certain points during its more illustrious years, the Byzantine Empire also included Egypt and all of the Levant. So it was an extremely widespread empire. And again, if we call it the East Roman Empire rather than the Byzantine Empire, we get an idea that this is it's historically contiguous, ontologically contiguous with what we think of as ancient Rome. And when people think of ancient Rome, they think of the Italian peninsula. All right, the Italian peninsula under Justinian was part of the Byzantine Empire. It later fell away, but that's for another discussion. So we've talked about the dates and the extent of the Byzantine Empire. In order to start off discussion of why I think the Byzantine Empire lasted so long, we have to go to an anecdote from my days in the U.S. Navy. When I was in the barracks at my first training command in the Navy, the guy in the barracks room next to me was this kind of cardboard cutout, stereotypical redneck Texan named Fireman Blundell. Fireman Blundell was the caricature of a redneck, myopic Texan. If you weren't from his little part of Texas, then you were either a steer or a queer. He talked with this kind of slow, drawling Texas accent. On the wall of his barracks room, he had this huge Texas flag. But you have to remember, though, you had to be from his specific county in Texas. Otherwise, you didn't count. Well, Blundell, what about DFW? No, faggots. What about Houston? No, homos. Well, what about El Paso? Mexicans. So this was Blundell, and this was the guy who was in the barracks next to me. Now, as for the rest of us, life in the Navy was kind of miserable and bleak. So to dispel the bleakness, we had to do silly stuff. We came up with nicknames for all of our shipmates. For example, there was Psych Ward Willie. He was the son of a fallen Church of Christ pastor from Oregon. There was Farmhand Carl. He was the big strapping farmhand from North Dakota. There was Drew the Jew. He was a lecherous Yid from LA. So we had it all. And also, in order to dispel the bleakness of our existence, we tried to take every opportunity we had to become civilians again. Thus, anytime we had liberty, we would throw off the uniforms and we would put on our best civilian clothes and go out on the town and pretend we were civilians. So one day I'm getting ready for my shipmates to come and pick me up for such an outing, and I'm straightening my tie, I'm putting on my jacket. The knock comes at the door. I open the door and exit, and I'm like, all right, fellas, let's go pick up Farmhand Carl and Drew the Jew. Well, Fireman Blundell happened to be leaning in the door of his barracks room, and he heard me say that. So he stepped out and said, there was only one good Jew, and his name was Jesus. Well, at the moment that I heard that, I just sort of dismissed it as this eccentric Blundellism. But now that I've had over a quarter century to ponder it, I'm starting to see the wisdom of Fireman Blundell's words. Because anywhere we are in the world where we find malfeasance afoot, all we have to do is draw back the curtain, and invariably we find some bagel-eating so-and-so at the controls. This reminds us of the words of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon recorded just about every conversation he had in the Oval Office. Those are called the Nixon tapes. And on the Nixon tapes, he's heard saying something to the effect of, Jews are inherently dishonest and disloyal. And he's disgusted that he can't find any echelon in the government that does not have a Jew atop it. Now, this is Richard Milhouse Nixon we're talking about. This is not some hardcore, hard-bitten, right-wing character. No, this is Richard Nixon. Nixon was so liberal that by today's standards, he would be either an independent or quite possibly even a Democrat. This is a guy who thought that personal ownership of guns was an abomination. This is a guy who helped to put a stake in the heart of the gold standard. We're not talking about some flaming right-wing radical here. This is a mainstream president of the United States who said that Jews were not trustworthy. And this brings us to what the topic of our discussion, political lessons from the Byzantine Empire. One of the most famous Byzantine emperors, aside from Constantine I, was Justinian I. He reigned during the 6th century. He was the one who convoked the 5th Ecumenical Council. So he's a very big player in the history of the Byzantine Empire and in Eastern Orthodoxy. In fact, in the Orthodox liturgy, there is a hymn that we sing called Only Begotten Son and Word of God. It's a defense of the Trinity, a defense of the divinity of Christ. It basically is an apologetic type of hymn. And this is attributed to Justinian I. We don't know if he actually wrote it, but it is very widely ascribed to him. So this is a man who had his finger in the pie of both the government and the church. In fact, let me turn off my camera so I can show you an image. You can see my avatar is a two-headed eagle with a crown over it. That was the symbol of the Byzantine Empire. The crown was meant to symbolize the emperor, and the two heads were meant to represent the church and the state, which meant to say that the emperor was sovereign over both church and state. That's something I don't care for. I don't want anyone outside of the church being sovereign over the church. But we'll get back to that in a few moments. Prior to Justinian's reign, there was an emperor named Theodosius. And they were always trying to modify the Roman code law, because remember, this is the East Roman Empire. This is a continuation of Rome. Rome was, for centuries, a pagan and sometimes overtly anti-Christian empire. In fact, it was that way until AD 324, when Constantine became the sole emperor and extended tolerance to all Christians. So one of the emperors who had tried to reform the Roman law and to pick it clean of any of the lingering paganism that was in it was Theodosius. This is called the Theodosian Code. The Theodosian Code put a number of civil restrictions on Jews living in the empire. Let me distinguish between civil and natural. Civil rights and natural rights are two different things. Everybody has natural rights. This is what's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The original wording was life, liberty, and pursuit of property, but they thought that sounded too venal, so they changed it to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Everybody has a right to that. Nobody has a right to take life, liberty, and pursuit of property away from you. If you commit a capital crime, then conceivably the state can have you executed. But no citizen is allowed to deprive you of those rights. But now we come to something else called civil rights. Civil rights belong to citizens. And the Byzantine Empire distinguished between different types of citizens. You had pagans on one end of the continuum, and you had Christians on the other end of the continuum. And in between, you had other groups, most notably the Jews. So the Jews were able to reside in the Byzantine Empire, but they were not full-blown citizens. And when we get to Justinian, who was one of Theodosius's successors, Justinian puts into place what I consider one of his most important works, aside from commissioning the building of Hagia Sophia, which is that famous church, which is now a mosque/museum in Istanbul. The work I'm talking about is the Corpus Juris Civilis. I'm pronouncing that like church Latin, so I don't want people to say it's civilis or civilis. No, I'm pronouncing it like church Latin, so it's civilis. The Corpus Juris Civilis was the code law of the Byzantine Empire from Justinian forward. What he did was to have his jurisprudence look through the Roman law and finish picking out everything that the Theodosian law, the Theodosian Code, had not picked out that was of pagan origin and that was biased against Christians. And this work does something that's very important. This work forbids Jews from holding any government office. Jews are also forbidden from being in the educational system. Why? Because this is an empire. This is a polity that is self-consciously Christian and unembarrassedly Christian. They're saying, we are a Christian empire. We are going to be governed by Christians. Our children are going to be taught by Christians. It is not fit for a Christian to be ruled over by a Jew, and it is not fit for a Christian child to be taught by a Jew. So the Byzantine Empire, in its official code law, excluded Jews from the government and from the educational system. Careful now. The government did not kill Jews. This is not Nazism. The government did not exile all the Jews. This is not like 13th century England. The Jews were allowed to remain in the empire. They were allowed to conduct commerce, but they remained second-class citizens. They were not allowed to govern over Christians, and the empire presumed that all citizens would be Christians, nor were they allowed to teach Christians. Right. We talked about the two-headed eagle. We talked about the length of the Byzantine Empire's reign, that it was 1,100 years. Over 1,100 years, this empire lasted. In my opinion, that's because of the Justinianic and Theodosian codes. We have two data. Datum number one is the empire lasted for 1,100 years. Datum number two, Jews were excluded from the government and from the educational system. In my opinion, those two data are linked. The reason the Byzantine Empire lasted as long as it did is because it kept Jews out of power. This is something that Mr. Moderate, Richard Nixon, would say yes to. And by the way, if I were saying what I'm saying to you right now, 26 years ago, when I was having that conversation with Blundell, I probably would have been excoriated by my friends and shipmates, and I would have been labeled a racist if I had had any kind of national platform. Racist, anti-Semite, Jew hater, whatever you want to call it. Times have changed. Let me give you an illustration of how times have changed. I remember when this fake conservative named Michael Medved, a Jew, was hosting a major talk show in the United States, a radio talk show. Michael Medved, if you haven't heard of him, he frequently sat in for Rush Limbaugh when Rush was away from the microphone. And of course, Medved had his own radio show too. Prior to that, he had been sort of a well-known movie critic. Lyons and Medved was the name of the show. He and this guy named Lyons were kind of like a copy of Siskel and Ebert, and they did movie reviews. So Medved was a well-known figure. I remember when this conservative, for those who are only listening by audio, I'm making the scare quotes there. This conservative, Michael Medved, anytime he was asked about the Lavon affair or the USS Liberty by one of his callers, he would simply start talking over the caller. He would turn down the caller's volume, and then he would basically shame the caller for having asked the question. So the lesson that we all took away from that is, there are certain topics you just can't bring up. If you bring up any kind of malfeasance that's been done by the state of Israel, that's anti-Semitic, pal. You can't talk about that. Keep your mouth shut. I don't care if you call yourself a conservative. Keep your mouth shut, pal. No criticism of the Jews. So, shortly after the Blundell affair, and Blundell, Fireman Blundell was my shipmate in the Navy, who made that remark about Jews. Shortly after that, I got sent to my first duty station, and I was sent to a Muslim country. So while I was there, I decided that I would take advantage of that by amassing as much Islamic propaganda as I could get my hands on, because I had it in the back of my head that one day I would do kind of like a Christianity versus Islam type of ministry. So I was frequenting the huge mosque that was behind my apartment building. They were funded by Saudi Arabia, so you could walk out of there with armloads of very expensive, beautiful diglot Qurans, one side English, the other side Arabic, or one side French, one side Arabic, one side Chinese, one side Arabic. They had every language. I was also frequenting a little office elsewhere in the country that was dedicated to propagating the Islamic religion. So you could go in there and they would give you a list of, back then they were audio tapes and VHS tapes. You could say it was a catalog of all of this Islamic propaganda that you could get. Again, in any language. You could get it in Hindi, you could get it in Malayalam, English, French, whatever language you wanted. So I was picking up all of this propaganda. I noticed that some of the tapes that they were giving away, they gave all this stuff away too. Everything was free. Some of the tapes they were giving away were by an American politician and writer named David Duke. Okay, giving away my age here, I went to college in the 1980s and early 1990s. Okay, I remember, I was like 17 years old when I started college, and I was taking my English 101 class. My English 101 professor was this raging, strident feminist. every day, this was her routine. Every time she came into class, she would storm in. And for some reason, we were taking English 101 in a biology lab. So she would like slam it down on the front. It was like a sink, because this was like a biology classroom. She would slam her books down, and then she would rage about whatever liberal political issue was the hot button topic of the day. And I was 17 years old, so I just kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to get eviscerated by this screaming hag. But this woman, one day, I remember she was one of the topic of her rage for that particular morning was David Duke. Okay, so fast forward back to the time that I'm in the Navy. I'm picking up these David Duke takes. I'm listening to them, and I'm thinking, these are a little far out, a little extreme for my taste. So this was right about the time that 9/11 happened, and he's kind of postulating that the Jews were behind 9/11, and then he was talking about the Lavon affair and the USS Liberty, which back then you were not supposed to talk about because Jews had the upper hand in those days, and they simply made those forbidden topics. So when I finished my tour of duty there in the Middle East, the Navy sent me back to the United States for shore duty. And I started attending an Orthodox church in the next city over from the city that I lived in. And one day I handed the priest those 2 David Duke tapes. And I said, hey, why don't you have a listen to these, see what you think. The next Sunday, he came back with the tapes in his hand, and he was scowling. He goes, that David Duke is such a demagogue. So this was early 2000s that this is happening. I have since started a YouTube channel called Christian Theological Archive. So if anybody goes on YouTube, just type in @Christian Theological Archive, and this will come up. I digitized those 2 audio tapes, turned them into a digital audiogram video, and I put them up onto YouTube about 6-7 months ago. And, this was the first time in like 2 decades I had listened to them. And as I'm listening to them, I'm thinking it sounds really mainstream. And I'm thinking, whoa, 20 years ago, I was pretty hardcore conservative. And even 20 years ago, I thought this was kind of far out there. And my priest hated it, called him a demagogue. But I'm listening to it now. I'm like, sounds like what any mainstream conservative would be saying now in 2026.
Times are changing.
That the Overton window has shifted. So let's get back to this idea of the long existence of the Byzantine Empire. This is an empire that at one point extended from parts of Spain. It went around in kind of like a backward letter C across the Mediterranean. Basically, all of the littoral of the Mediterranean under Justinian was the Byzantine Empire. Then it started contracting to the point where it was only Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece. Then it contracted a little more when the Muslims invaded, and we lost Egypt and we lost the Levant. But basically, that heartland was almost always the Anatolian Peninsula and Greece. And this empire lasted for 1,100 years. So why has nobody ever heard of it? I remember I was working in an engineering firm. This was probably 15 years ago. And I was talking to this engineer named Quinn. And I was like, blip, 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 Byzantine Empire, blip, 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 Heraclius, blip, 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 Byzantine Empire, blip, 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 Western Empire. I was saying all this stuff. And one of our coworkers was with us in Quinn's office. The engineer was named Quinn. I remember this because the other guy in the office with us was like 6'6". So he was standing behind me, just towering above me. And when I said Byzantine Empire, I noticed that Quinn's eyes glazed over. And then the guy who was behind me stopped me, and he pointed at Quinn and said, "You don't even know what Paul's talking about, do you?" And Quinn kind of sheepishly goes, "Nope, don't know." So I had to explain to him what the Byzantine Empire was. I had to explain basically what the Roman Empire was, because the Byzantine Empire is was the continuation of the Roman Empire. So people are incredibly blissfully ignorant of this. Now, yeah.
It's all fresh for me too. So,
yeah. So I mean, even when I
knew
was a
very
child,
little before this. So.
You know, when I was a child, I was raised as a Southern Baptist. So I remember the history books talked about the Byzantine Empire. I remember seeing it in the history books. It's amazing I actually read it because I was so lazy in elementary school. I just didn't read anything if I could get away with not reading it. But I remember the maps. The maps showed Greece and Anatolia. It said, this is the Byzantine Empire. And I remember like later on, they showed a couple of icons. So I said, oh, okay, so this is like Orthodox Christianity. So that's basically all I knew about it. But at least I knew it existed, okay? A lot of people, highly educated people like engineers, they never heard of it. They never heard of the Byzantine Empire. Now, why is that? The reason is because the Jews dominate academia. The Jews dominate the educational system in the United States and in Europe. And because of that, they have wiped out the memory of this empire. And why have they wiped out the memory? Because this is an empire that excluded them from power. And as a result of excluding them from power, it prospered for 1,100 years.
Wow.
It prospered for 1,100 years. I believe it's because it excluded the Jews. If you want more evidence of that too, you can look at Spain. Now, there's that famous date, 1492. What happened in 1492? Tell me, what happened? Columbus, yeah. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, do you know what else happened in 1492? Ferdinand and Isabella got together and they finally completed the expulsion of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. It's called the Reconquista, the reconquest. Another thing they did in 1492 was to expel all of the Jews. And what happened from 1492 forward? You had a Spanish golden age. Spain started discovering all these lands in the New World. They started shipping huge amounts of silver back to the Iberian Peninsula. Spain became unbelievably rich and prosperous. Okay? You know, and prior to that time, there had been Jews in Spain. Some Jews even converted to Christianity. But the Spanish, kind of like Richard Nixon, were of the opinion that Jews were inherently disloyal and untrustworthy. So they referred to these Jews as conversos. And they said, all right, pal, you've converted to Christianity, or at least you claim to have converted. We're going to watch you for about a decade to make sure that you're not coming in to just undermine us by claiming to be one of us and secretly working against us while being called a Christian. That's Spain. What we have to do now in our politically correct age is to look back on Spain and look back on the Byzantine Empire and scoff and go, oh, small-minded bigots. We nowadays in our modern times are more moral and far more intelligent than any of them. Well, really?
That's a joke.
Really? Are we more intelligent than the Byzantine Empire? The Jews have a very bad history against Christians, of hating Christians and trying to kill Christians, or at least undermine them. The council, I think it was Council of First Nicaea, one of the canons in there is no Christian is allowed to be operated on by a Jewish doctor, because the assumption is that Jewish doctor will kill you when he's performing surgery on you, and he'll do it deliberately. One of the earliest writings of the Church Fathers is called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And in this story, Polycarp is brought before the Roman officials. He's put in front of the crowd, this hostile crowd in the arena, and he mocks them and refuses to recant the Christian faith. So they tie him to a post and try to set him on fire. They fail to set the wood on fire. So then they stab him to death. But prior to stabbing him to death, it says that the Jews were well to the fore, as always, with their assistance of the pagans in their persecution of the Christians. So it was the Jews running out looking for all the firewood to set Polycarp on fire. There is a later church father named Athanasius. He was born in the late 3rd century and lived well into the 4th century. He was a deacon at the Council of Nicaea and later became a very renowned bishop. He's a revered saint in the Orthodox Church. If Athanasius said that you were, quote unquote, Jew-minded, he was not paying you a compliment. Okay, can we look through these church fathers and admit that one of the characteristics of these church fathers is they hated the Jews? Are we going to look back on people like this and say, nah, just stupid, just immoral? Now we're so much smarter and so much more moral than they are. No, that's laughable. We may have better technology than the ancients had, but we certainly do not have more wisdom. So to recap, we have a Byzantine Empire that lasts for 1,100 years. This empire, inexplicably, is unheard of in our day, and people don't even know of it. It's unknown. It has been flushed down the toilet of history unless you are Greek or unless you happen to practice the Orthodox faith. For example, the big cathedral here in town has a Byzantine flag that it flies over the dome. I think that's great. And the reason is because the Jews who control academia and control scholarship want this empire wiped out, because this empire is an object lesson to us. This is an empire that excluded Jews from power and therefore prospered. And you know what? The Jews in academia are doing everything in their power simply to wipe out the name of Christ, period. We have markers in our historical dates of BC and AD. BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. So one of these terms is English and one is Latin. There are some issues with the calendar. You know, I probably wouldn't object to modifying the calendar or even changing it altogether to something more astronomically accurate and terminologically accurate too. For example, September is the 9th month of the year, but it means month 7. Sept is 7. So we have all of these anomalies in our calendar that should probably be fixed. I mean, I'm not going to push that. But the reason the academic world is pushing the BC and AD out of the picture and is now saying, no, replace BC with BCE, before Common Era, and AD, replace that with CE, Common Era, is because this is something that has been pushed by Jewish academics since the mid-19th century. Jewish academics in the mid-19th century started pushing CE and BCE. I had never even heard these terms until probably the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. So these are recent terms of BCE and CE. And if you trace it back, you find the ones who most pushed this or first began pushing this were the Jews of academia. Now, was anybody surprised by that? I don't think anyone should be surprised. So they're trying to wipe out the name of Christ from the historical nomenclature. And they have successfully wiped out the Byzantine Empire from historical knowledge. You go talk to educated people, they don't even know what the Byzantine Empire is. So, bottom line, an important positive theological lesson we learn from the Byzantine Empire is the Richard Nixon approach. Keep your eye on the Jews and keep them out of power. Okay, I'm Eastern Orthodox. I like the Byzantine Empire. I'll show you my symbol again. That's the two-headed Byzantine eagle there on screen. But the Byzantine Empire was not perfect. In fact, when I was in my conversion process, going from Protestant to Orthodox, my favorite catechist was a then Orthodox priest named David Anderson. I say then because he was born a papist, became Orthodox, and then reverted to papistry. There's no accounting for taste. But when I was Orthodox, when I was becoming Orthodox, he was still Orthodox. And I was consuming his materials very avidly. And he said at several points in his video lectures that the Byzantine Empire is an empire where he would never have wanted to live. I might be of the same opinion as he is. I would like to see a Byzantine republic eventually reestablished, but there would have to be some changes over the way things were done in late antiquity forward, 324 to 1453. We would have to make some changes. So the symbol, once again, the two-headed eagle, the crown representing the emperor and his authority, his sovereignty over church and state. I'm not a fan of that. I certainly believe that church and state should have a relationship. However, my opinion is the relationship should go one way. It should always be the church informing the state. It should never be the state informing the church. And at several times in the history of the Byzantine Empire, we had the unfortunate situation where the state was informing the church. We can go back to Justinian I, this emperor for whom I expressed quite a bit of praise. I'm very fond of the Corpus Juris Civilis. Something I'm not fond of, and this will get me in trouble, is the Council of Second Constantinople, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which he convoked. He was so intent, for political reasons and military reasons, to reconcile the church to the Monophysites, who had basically peeled off from the church at the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451, that he basically gave over 4 people to be condemned posthumously. These were 4 people, well, 3 of them were disliked intensely by the Monophysites, and one of them was very intensely disliked by Justinian. The one who was disliked by Justinian was Origen. He was a figure from the very early history of the church, an absolutely brilliant writer. He had a number of ideas that were completely insane, but he was brilliant, and he was revered as a saint and prayed to by many people in Eastern Christianity. The church officially anathematizes Origen's writings and Origen as a person at that council. And then among the 3 other people that they offered up for sacrifice, Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret, and Ibis the Persian, Theodoret was especially hated by the Monophysites because Theodoret had critiqued the anathemas of Cyril that Cyril had promulgated at the Council of Ephesus many hundreds of years prior to that. So he was an enemy of Cyril, so the Monophysites didn't like him. So Justinian instructs the bishops at this council to condemn Theodoret posthumously. I don't like that at all. Now, I'm Orthodox, so I'm stuck with it, because if you're Orthodox, if you're in a club, you play by the club rules. And the club rule is this is an ecumenical council. So I'm stuck with that, but I'm going to say I don't like it. I'm going to be on the record saying that. So this was an instance of the state sticking its nose into the business of the church. And in my opinion, that caused a train wreck. There are other instances of this. After the Council of Chalcedon, we had mentioned that, it was AD 451, the Emperor Zeno released a document that's called the Henoticon. The Henoticon was the first of many attempts to try to reconcile the Monophysites to the church in Constantinople. The church in Constantinople defended the position that is espoused to this day in Eastern Orthodoxy, that Christ has a nature that is fully human, and he also has a nature that is fully divine. These 2 natures are fused together indissolubly, yet they are not mixed. That's the position of the Council of Chalcedon. That's the position of the Orthodox Church to this day. That position was rejected by the churches that we call Monophysite or Miaphysite. I guess Miaphysite is the politically correct term that people want to use now. I'm not politically correct, so I'm going to keep saying Monophysite. So he put out this document called the Henoticon, and it has imperial imprimatur on it, meaning it's authoritative, and it didn't satisfy anyone. The Western Church rejected it, the Eastern Church rejected it, and the Monophysites rejected it. So it was a massive failure. This is an attempt of the government trying to put its nose into the theological affairs of the church, and it failed. Okay, along comes the Second Council of Constantinople. That's AD 553. We already talked about that. That just causes more problems with the Monophysites. So what you get in 638, AD 638, is something called the Ekthesis. That is promulgated by the Emperor Heraclius. Now, Heraclius was a military genius. He was a genius on the level of Napoleon, Douglas MacArthur, you name it. He was an absolute genius. The empire prior to that time had allowed its military to become extremely emaciated. And as a result, the Persian army started encroaching on the territory of the Byzantine Empire and started gobbling up more and more of this, and basically started holding these emperors, metaphorically speaking, for ransom. The Byzantine emperors basically had to pay off the Persians not to take more of the territory. So Heraclius put a stop to that. He invaded Persia and completely destroyed the Persian army. And by the way, that's why Persia ended up falling to the Muslims, because the Muslims arose right on the heels of this military disaster for the Persians. The Byzantine Empire had destroyed their army, and so they were left with no defense, and the Arabs just walked in and took over and forced those Zoroastrians to become Muslims. It was a disaster for Persia. So Heraclius, great military genius, but this document that he promulgated, which was called the Ecthesis, was another one of these butchered attempts to try to reconcile the Orthodox to the Monophysites. So what was promulgated in the Ecthesis is something known as monothelitism, the idea that Christ has only one will. Well, that's refuted in the Gospel of Matthew. "Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." That's two wills. So the teaching that the Orthodox Church holds to this day is the teaching of the two wills, not monothelitism, which is one will. Well, naturally, this ecthesis flopped. Nobody liked it. The Western half of the Orthodox Church hated it. The Eastern half of the Orthodox Church hated it. And the Monophysites hated it. Everybody rejected it. It was yet another government failure. Now, after that, we come up with something called the Typos. This was promulgated in AD 648 by the Emperor Constans II. Constans II basically just threw up his hand and said, "You know what? I'm sick of this argument between you saying he has two wills and saying he has one will, and over here you're saying he has one will, one nature, and over here you say he has two natures, or you're saying he's got one nature that's a mix of the two. I'm sick of this. We are officially making it illegal for anyone to discuss this topic further." So basically, he thought by stomping on the country, stomping on the empire with his jackboot, he could solve the problems between the Monophysites and the Orthodox. Well, it didn't work. There was a brilliant monk named Maximus the Confessor who resisted him and refused to sign on to the Typos. Pope Martin in the West also refused. And so they arrested Pope Martin and they started bringing him to the Byzantine Empire, and he died en route. They were going to put him on trial. They were going to put the Pope on trial. Maximus the Confessor, they did manage to get their hands on him, and they brought him back, and they chopped off his hand and cut out his tongue. Maximus the Confessor is a great saint in the Orthodox Church. He is also a pillar of Christological theology. Everybody looks back to Maximus. Maximus, and then prior to him, the three Cappadocians. So Maximus the Confessor is one of the all-time great church fathers, and the imperial government, the government that I was singing the praises of earlier in the show, had his tongue cut out and chopped off his hand so that he couldn't write or speak, which is what the Typos was demanding of everyone, not to write or speak on the topic anymore. So, obviously, you can see that the Byzantine Empire gives us positive lessons about how to keep an empire running for 1,100 years, and it gives us a lot of bad lessons about how not to do this. The bad lesson is the government needs to keep its big fat nose out of the affairs of the church. But if the church wants to inform the church or wants to inform the government, that's fine, because the church produces saints like Maximus the Confessor. These are the saints who could teach people something. And there were times in the Byzantine Empire where they listened to the saints. We have a category of saints in Eastern Orthodoxy called stylite saints. This refers to the Greek word for pillar. These are saints who would build little tiny dwellings on top of pillars from ruined Roman buildings. And they would stay on top of those pillars for years, just in nonstop prayer. And people started coming to them, understanding them to be living saints, and would ask for their intercessions. And Byzantine emperors and government officials would come to them as well to be informed by them because they were so close to God. So the church can inform the state because the church has wisdom. The state only has wisdom insofar as it listens to the church. So in my opinion, if we can show this symbol again, why don't we just say that the two heads are church and state, and the crown is the rule of Christ over the church and state. So how about we say that?
Yeah.
Now, looks like, according to this, I've been rambling for 50 minutes. So if you have any questions or if anybody else wants to ask anything, let me know.
Yeah. So I think what drew me to this topic is, first of all, you know, think about it. Like,
Caleb, I'm sorry, but your mic
has parallels. Did you lose me again?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
No worries. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think what do you think the parallels are between the Byzantine Empire kind of style and governments and what the Christian nationalists are pushing for? Do you see a lot of similarity there? Or do you think it's totally different? Obviously, you know, Protestants, Orthodox, or Roman Catholicism is going to win out. Like, can't be everybody, I think. But I mean, do you see similarity there as far as what the Christian nationalists are pushing for?
Well, I have an idea of what Christian nationalism means. I don't really follow that particular strain of thought, so I'm too busy with other things. I know that the left uses the term Christian nationalist as a put down. So you're going to have to explain to me what you mean by it, and then I can maybe draw some parallels. I'm sorry, your mic is not working again. Sorry. Nope. I regret, Caleb, the microphone appears to be dead. Well, let me just, since your microphone is conked out, I'll just talk a little bit. Again, the term Christian nationalist, I have a couple of friends who probably would identify as that. I've never been exactly clear what the description or what the term entails. So my understanding is that it's very politically conservative and it wants to have a government that's informed by Christianity. Although I'm also aware that there are certain neo-pagans who have an affinity for Odinism, basically Norse mythology, and they too are associated with that movement. So I'm not sure. I mean, are you going to have the Christian cross and the hammer of Thor next to each other? Well, if the hammer of Thor represents the Aryan race, I guess that would be okay. And then you could have the cross of Christ next to it to represent the Christian religion. I don't know if that's what that particular movement is looking for. Now, if we're going to talk about the parallels, this would be my opinion of it. I know a lot of Orthodox people are monarchists. They dislike Republican form of government. And by Republican, I'm saying with a small r. I'm not talking Republican Party.
Yeah.
I'm talking about kind of a representative democracy. That's what I mean when I say republic. I would be in favor of a Byzantine republic where the voting the only people allowed to vote are Orthodox Christian males over the age of 24. I say 24 because prior to the age of 24, a person's brain is not fully formed, and you're not going to be making the best decisions when it comes to voting. So professing Orthodox Christians over the age of 24 who have passed a rigorous catechetical, rigorous catechesis, right. They would be the voting citizens. The passive citizens would be non-Orthodox Christian males. So that would be other types of Christians. They were simply called heretics in the Byzantine Empire. Nowadays, that would be Protestants. And the Orthodox Church refers to Catholics as schismatics. So you can make a difference between schismatics and heretics if you want. By the way, I don't use the word heretic a whole lot. It's a heretic, cultist. These are just terms of abuse that people use for anyone they don't like. So
yeah,
take it or leave it. We'll just say non-Orthodox Christians. They will have, of course, natural rights, but they would be passive citizens. So they would not be allowed to vote. They would not be in government, and they would not be in the educational system. I mean, they could go to school, but they would not be teachers. They would not be professors. That's what I would seek. All right, I think your microphone's working again.
Yeah, I'm talking into the box now. But
okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty similar to what I hear from people like Stephen Wolfe and Joel Webbin and Doug Wilson. But like you're saying, a group is going to win out. And I would much rather, whether the Roman Catholics win, whether the Eastern Orthodox win, or the Protestants, I'd be okay with that situation.
All right.
As opposed to what we have now. But yeah.
I think just about anything is better than what we have now.
Right. So if you guys win, no hard feelings. Yeah. I won't vote, and we'll have a more moral government, and that'll be all right.
Yeah. Now, what I would say too about the head of state, I'm not in favor of monarchy, because God very clearly in the Old Testament is against monarchy. He only allows ancient Israel to have it in order to accommodate them and keep them from sliding off into worse paganism. What I would like to have is an elected official. So like a president who would be elected, and he would also have to be answerable to a Congress of some kind, a parliament. And there would have to be some kind of judicial system. So the tricameral idea that we have in the United States could be something that's workable in a Byzantine Republic. The worst aspect of our tricameral system is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is out of control. And that's because we have common law in the United States rather than code law. So in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States and Canada, everything except for Louisiana and Quebec are under English common law. English common law is judge-made law. A judge decides a case, and that case becomes precedent. In other words, this is rule by judges. Rule by judges has failed miserably in the United States. Also, it is an unbiblical system. If you look at the book of Leviticus and other books in the Bible that lay out a lot of law, it is code law. For example, it will say, you in Exodus 18, you will not commit any homosexual act. And then in Leviticus 20, it says, if you do commit a homosexual act, you will be executed. It says in Leviticus 18, you will not commit incest with your grandchildren. And then over in chapter 20, it tells you what the penalty for all of these remaining infractions are. That's known as code law. Code law is what you have in the Bible, and it's what you had in the Byzantine Empire. And in my opinion, the corpus juris civilis of Justinian, which put very strict restrictions on Jews, is part of the reason the Byzantine Empire succeeded. So if we were to have a tricameral system, the judiciary would be governed by code law. It would not be common law.
I like that. So I might be confusing the terms, but like Old Testament law, I mean, so you'd be in favor of that being an operating principle, like for a government?
Well, no.
I'm mixing those up, aren't I?
Old Testament law, for example, Leviticus. I am in 2024, I read through the book of Leviticus 30 times. 30 times. So every single week I read through the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, number one, is not in order. I was telling you that the infractions, the sexual infractions, are listed in chapter 18, and the punishments are in chapter 20. Obviously, they belong together. Why do you have a chapter coming between the penalty and the infraction? That's just foolishness. And there are glaring non sequiturs all throughout Leviticus. I put it back together on a spreadsheet in a way that makes a lot more sense. And I'm planning to make a book out of that.
Oh, I see.
But one thing you'll notice about the Old Testament is they give you an infraction, and then they give you what is, by anyone's definition, a draconian punishment for it, usually death. By the time you get to Deuteronomy, a lot of that is getting dropped. So the infraction remains in place, but is the punishment still in place? I don't know. Because in Exodus, you get the 10 commandments, and one of those commandments is honor the Sabbath day. And Exodus also tells you anyone breaking the Sabbath will be executed. But what happened in the time of Christ, when Christ and his apostles are walking through a wheat field? The disciples are taking the heads of wheat and they're grinding them between their palms so they can eat them. That's labor. They're doing labor on the Sabbath. And when the Pharisees rightly point out, hey, that's work on the Sabbath, Christ responds, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the reason why I'm hesitant to say these things about that, why we should impose Old Testament law, is because very obviously the punishments for those have been attenuated or even gotten rid of altogether. Like the punishment for Sabbath breaking is not simply attenuated, it's abolished. You can break the Sabbath at will.
Is that because Jesus was present, though?
Well, I mean, you can find other instances in the Old Testament where a lot of this stuff is greatly attenuated. For example, in the book of Numbers, you have a couple of the families of the Levites under Dathan, Abiram, and Korah, demanding that they be allowed to offer incense in the tabernacle, just like the Aaronic order. And you know the story there. Fire comes out and devours Dathan and Abiram, and then the earth cleaves asunder and swallows Korah and his band, because they had tried to usurp the priestly duties. Well, what happens under the reigns of David and Solomon? David is offering up sacrifices as the Ark of the Covenant's coming back to town. That's a priestly duty. David and his men go into the holy place and steal the showbread. That would have gotten them killed in a previous era. But Jesus refers back to that and says, see, David did it. It's okay. So the question arises, why were a lot of these rules put in place to begin with? Well, I have been of the opinion for over 20 years, and by the way, this is the opinion that a number of church fathers held. There is a first legislation, which is the moral law of the Old Testament, and that stands for all time. And then there is a second legislation, which is the punishment for the golden calf incident. And that, by and large, is all of those sacrifices you see in the latter half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and a good portion of Numbers. And that is just completely obliterated because God didn't want the second legislation to begin with. In fact, the church fathers started out with an even more radical position than that. They said at the golden calf, God sundered his relationship with Israel altogether. He didn't just modify it, he cut it off. The later church fathers modified that and said, no, he just gave them the second legislation as punishment. So in my opinion, the second legislation happened because of the golden calf. The golden calf, if you know your Egyptology, the Jews are always saying in the book of Numbers, we want to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. We miss the leeks and the cucumbers we used to have. Well, apparently they also miss the gods they used to have, because the golden calf, according to Egyptologists, is a copy of the Apis bull, or the Menevus bull, or the Bucus bull. These were living bulls that the Egyptians worshipped. They weren't statues, they were living bulls. So the Israelites made a statue of this Apis, or Menevus, or Bucus god that the Egyptians had. So God says to them, in effect, okay, you want to worship Egyptian religion? I'll give you the pagan religion you want. I'm going to make it incredibly onerous on you. And I'm only going to give you enough to make sure you don't slide off into worse paganism. So you have these incredibly stupid things in Leviticus, like votive offerings. A votive offering is where you go to the tabernacle and you promise God, hey, God, if you give me this windfall of money, if you give me this job, if you give me this woman I want to marry, I will give you the value of this slave in my household, or I'll give you the value of this cow, or I'll give you the cow itself if I can't give you the money, the monetary value of it. So basically, this is a despicable a type of bargaining with God, as if you could buy off God. But God allows it. I told you the book of Leviticus is massively out of order. I think that the people who put Leviticus back together after the Babylonian exile were so embarrassed by those votive offerings that they stuck them at the very end of Leviticus. That's chapter 27 of Leviticus as we have it. I think that's why they put it there, because it's technically a peace offering. It belongs with the descriptions of the peace offerings of Thanksgiving. All right, so long and the short of it, no on Old Testament law, because it would be a huge dispute, even among Christians, what parts of the old law are retained and whether the punishments are retained or whether they're attenuated, and so on and so forth. So no on the Old Testament law. In my opinion, we should have a law that's consonant with natural law theory. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are concepts that come from natural law theory. Natural law theory is something that would be accepted by all persons throughout all history, regardless of what their particular civilization and culture would have been. It's just something that is instinctive and inherent in the human psyche. That's what it should be based on. So, by the way, the whole homosexual movement and the laws that were put in from 2015 forward, saying that homosexual marriage is good to go. This is another instance of judge-made law, because all of the statutes that were put forth by state legislatures prior to the era of political correctness had restrictions on homosexuality and had punishments for it, very often a fine or even a prison sentence. But judge-made law came along and said, no, we judges, we understand the Constitution. Sodomy is good to go. And just think of this from the standpoint of natural law theory. And I regret if this is going to be offensive to any of the viewers, but let's imagine that we have a 13-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. They're perfectly healthy. They're happy. They're being raised out in the country. They're 13, so they're teens now. So they're starting to get some kind of sexual feelings in their body, and they've got sexual ideas in their heads. The girl would be having sexual ideas about boys. The boy would be having sexual ideas about girls. And if some adult came up to those kids and said, okay, again, I regret if this is offensive. If he said to the boy, how would you like to suck another boy's penis? The instant answer from that kid would be gross. That would be his natural instinct. The only time people have those natural instincts suppressed is if the school system is telling them homosexuality is great, or if they have been sexually abused by a homosexual themselves.
Right.
That's the only time. If you take somebody who's not been exposed to the school system, just a normal, healthy boy, hey, you want to have sex with another boy? Gross. You say the same thing to the girl. Hey, how would you like to lick another girl's vagina? Gross.
Yeah, you have to be trained to think that stuff.
Propagandized.
Yeah,
so this is what I'm talking about by natural law theory. The Obergefell versus Hodges, which was the decision that came down from the Supreme Court in 2015, is contrary to natural law. I mean, forget about the Bible. Even if you don't believe in the Bible, natural law tells you that this is contrary to it. And according to a government, a righteous government that observes natural law theory would say, okay, yeah, we can't put this law on the books because it's contrary to natural law. And if they did put it on the books, it would be null and void. Enough said.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not hostile to natural law. Like Stephen Wolfe, he wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism. He's definitely in that natural law camp. I do have questions about, like, and I don't want to keep you all night, but like, how do you decide the severity of a punishment in that scheme? So, maybe you don't punish a homosexual for being a homosexual in their home, but maybe repeated, openly public type of displays, or obviously abuse or things like that. How do you decide, well, should they be put to death? Should they go to prison? Should they,
Yeah, you have to look at what Christ did, because in the book of Leviticus and again in Deuteronomy, if you just commit normal adultery, in other words, a man copulates with another man's wife, which is the definition of adultery, that was punishable by death, according to both the law before Deuteronomy and the law of Deuteronomy. But when Christ is confronted by the woman caught in adultery, he lets her go. He does not consent to her being stoned. So that tells me that the death penalty that was in place for all of those sexual infractions is done away with. So it is still a sin to commit homosexuality or to commit adultery. And it's still a sin and should be also a civil crime to commit homosexual sodomy. But again, you don't kill the sodomite. There might be some other penalty like loss of citizenship, exile, small prison sentence. I don't know, whatever you want to do. But you cannot send a signal to society that that's okay.
Right.
But
there has to be some kind of...
It looks to me from the life of Christ that those death penalty, the death penalty for most of those infractions in Leviticus is done away with.
Have you heard the argument for the woman caught in adultery that they were trying to put her to death outside of the process of the law? So like a theonomist might argue that, like, they were basically going about it wrong. They were trying to go around the process and pursue like a mob mentality rather than following the... Okay. I don't know if that's the strongest argument. It's just one that I've heard.
There are several instances in the Old Testament where it says, if so-and-so does something, especially if somebody utters blasphemy, you yourself are to pick up stones and stone him. So it looks to me like the Pharisees were doing, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the Herodians, whoever it was who brought this woman in front of Christ, they were doing what the letter of the law said to do. Okay. But Christ says, no, whoever's without sin cast the first stone. And by saying that, he completely diffused the situation because the antagonist went away. And when the woman says, and when he says to the woman, where are they, thine accusers? And he says, none, Lord. And he says to her, neither do I condemn thee. Go thy way and sin no more. So he obviously it's a sin because he identifies it as a sin, but he has diffused the situation in a way that makes it impossible for anybody to stone the woman, which is what the letter of the law would have done. So this could feed back into my thesis that a lot of that stuff in the Old Testament is punishment for the golden calf. This has a lot of apologetics value too, because when you read the Old Testament, hey, how could you butcher entire societies, men, women, children, and animals? Disgusting. This can't be the real God. If you look at the Old Testament, there are instances prior to the golden calf incident where he says, I will drive out these nations before you. I will send the hornet before you. So it looks like God was bit by bit going to drive the Canaanites out of the land by natural means. But he said, okay, golden calf. All right. You want to live like pagans? All right. If you want to occupy this land, you're going to have to kill the occupants. And, killing people takes a toll on you. We hear of post-traumatic stress syndrome. That happens to a lot of these guys because they had to kill people in Iraq and Afghanistan. Normal people don't want to kill people. Only psychos want to kill people. The Nazis figured that out really fast in World War II because as they were pushing farther and farther east into Eastern Europe and then into the Soviet Union, they were executing Jews as they went along. And they were having the ordinary German soldiers do this. And these ordinary German soldiers were ruined. They were ruined psychologically by this. So the SS figured out, okay, we got psychos in our society. Let's make the psychos the SS. And so the SS gleefully killed off the Jews because normal people don't want to kill others. And this was a problem in World War II as well. They discovered that a lot of American troops were deliberately missing the Japanese or the Germans, whoever we were fighting. They would aim and then deliberately fire away because they didn't want to be guilty of killing somebody. They fixed that in the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, when Americans went to boot camp for the Army and the Marines, they basically got drummed into them for 12 to 15 weeks that the East Asians were gooks. That's a derogatory term for an East Asian. So they basically had to dehumanize the enemy in boot camp, and they found that the kill rate among soldiers and Marines in the Vietnam War was a lot better than it was in World War II. So, the fact that the Israelites had to go through and kill these Canaanites could have been punishment for them. I mean, and think about it too, this is ancient warfare. You don't have like the M1 Garand that you can shoot from 100 yards away in World War II, or you don't have an M16 like you had in Vietnam, where you can, shoot a guy from a distance. We're talking ancient warfare. You have to brandish your sword and run it through the guy, or cut him in half, or chop his head off. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, this is in modern warfare. The closest is running a guy through with a bayonet, and that's hard enough. Okay, can you imagine having to do it with a pike or a sword or an axe, or just clubbing someone to death with a mace? It's disgusting. If you're normal, that's going to be very damaging to you psychologically.
For sure. Yeah.
That's my opinion on the matter.
Yeah. Well, hey, that's a lot to think about. Do you got anything last second words you want to say? I want to honor your time, and I don't want to keep you on the hook all night. So,
it looks like we've been on for an hour and a quarter, so we should probably just wrap it up here.
Yes, sir. Well, thanks for coming on.
All right.
Here we go.